Okay, thank you, Reggie. So I'm delighted to introduce Vicki Szabo. We've been working with Vicki for quite a few years. I was just trying to remember when the first time I met, it was probably with Anne Brundle,
Yeah.
a very, very long time ago up here in Orkney. But so Vicki is based at the Western Carolina University, where she's recently been upgraded to professor, which is very nice for Vicki. And I must put in a plug for her book, Monstrous Fishes in the Meat Dark Sea. It's no longer available, but if you get a copy, through the library, it's fantastic. This has everything you could ever want to know about history of whaling in the medieval North Atlantic, as well as archaeology, and it's a fantastic resource. So Vicki's going to be talking about the work she's been doing on material from Orkney, as well as other sites across the North Atlantic. And then in the second half, I'm going to talk in particular about one site that Vicki's been able to tell us about what the bones are, and then I'm going to give the wider history of that particular site, and that's Cata Sand on Sunday. So over to you, Vicki.
All right, I'm going to try to share my screen, and I hope you all can see it. Yes, good to go? Nice to see everyone. As I was telling Jen and Raga, I've just gotten through 3 lectures on the National Park System and the Punic Wars. So if I lapse into something about Carthage, just somebody send a comment, move on. I'm excited to talk today about what was a 3-year project that's become an 8-year project. I'm part 1 of the show tonight, speaking about our transdisciplinary analysis of whalebone from Newfoundland all the way to Orkney. So you can see on the screen the
I can't see anything. Can you, Reggie?
I can see the presentation, but Vicki went quiet.
I can't even see the presentation. Bear with us, guys.
Maybe Vicki lost connection at the crucial moment here. Colleen says that she's still seeing the presentation.
I'm just seeing a white screen. No sound. We're divided among those of us who can and those of us who can't see it. The sound has indeed gone. I'm just going to drop her an email.
I'll pause the recording meanwhile.
Todd. Am I back in? Yep. Okay. I'm going to go again. I don't know if you heard any of that transdisciplinary project. You got me? Good. Archaeology, history, and molecular data, and I'm going to just keep going. If y'all can keep on screen so I can see you if something goes off. So we started our project in 2015. We had a 3-year project to do 1,000 years of analysis across the North Atlantic, history, archaeology, and molecular data. We're now in year 8, so something's going right. I attribute that to Orkney. We added Orkney in about year 4 or 5 of the project. And what I want to talk about tonight is this big transdisciplinary 1,500-year project and what we know now. So the project started with archaeologists from Greenland, Iceland, and Orkney. We started with a focus on Norse sites. We've sampled over the last 7 years about 37 Norse sites. As you can see, we're pretty attentive to seasonal occupations, coastal sites, inland sites, high and low status. Our goal has really been to try to understand how whales were used in a snapshot across this millennial scale, across all these different types of sites. We added the Iron Age in when we got to the Cairns, and we added in a few whaling stations in Iceland just for a comparative look closer to the end of the project. So we've had about 500 whale bones that we've sampled for collagen and for DNA. And of course, the highlight of all the sites is the Cairns. I think we had the most fun when we were in Orkney. Iceland's been delightful, but how do you not enjoy working at the Cairns with Martin? And I'm sure you all know much more about this site than I do. So I'm going to move very quickly through it. We sampled about 33 bones right before COVID, thank goodness. And the analysis of these bones showed incredibly well-preserved DNA. Turned up, as Martin, I think, has probably told all of you, I'm sure Martin's had t-shirts made with this. About 20 of those bones came from one fin whale, one remarkable fin whale, whose vertebra also contained the jawbone of the elder, from what I know from news recently. So this was, in many ways, our most unique site where we could really tell an interesting story. And I will thank Martin again and everyone in Orkney, because my students actually found me relevant for 5 minutes with the Cairns. All the coverage in the BBC and the Scotsman and everywhere else was really exciting for us. So this has been really one of the most exciting projects we worked on. But where our story began, and hopefully all these slides will show, I've had a lot of fun putting these together. I am an historian at heart. And when we began this project 8 years ago, I wanted to take a look at a baseline of what people understood whales to be. So I went back to some of the most outrageous medieval sources, medieval bestiaries. I went back to the Kingsmere, which is a delightful catalog, 13th century catalog, Norwegian catalog of whale species in the Icelandic seas, among other natural wonders. And the author of the Kingsmere talks about edibility and behavior and appearance. So it's a really nice sense of how people conceived of whales. And then coming back to an image that I'm sure many of you know really well, we had to include Olaus Magnus in establishing this baseline of ecological knowledge. And Olaus Magnus famously records all these monsters and engagements with humans at sea. So when we went back to these really well-known sites with a fresh eye, what we saw was, I see someone, Raga almost named her son Olaus Magnus. When we went back to these documents, we found Olaus clearly had ecological knowledge. He had either personal knowledge or spoke with sailors who observed whales at sea, engaging in acts like spy hopping or breaching, this fabulous activity that we're still sort of trying to understand why whales do it. Sometimes it's out of frivolity, sometimes it's to sort of out of competition. The Kingsmere says humpbacks are large, they're dangerous to ships, they'll strike at vessels, which is exactly what you see here in these airborne whales. Trap feeding, which was only recorded on video maybe a decade ago, is described by the bestiary. Whales will lay underneath the surface of the water and let fish jump into their mouths by emitting a sweet scent, and then they snap closed. So both in bestiary images and in the description, they're clearly observing whales engaged in these behaviors. I've only got two more. I find these utterly fascinating. Olaus Magnus depicted whales nursing, which scientists didn't record until maybe the past 20 years or so. So again, really good ecological knowledge. And what may be my favorite one that only exists in one source is whale migration. So drone video shows this, as did 16th century historian and artist Adrian Conan, talking about sperm whale migrations. And here you're looking at humpback whale migrations. So the point of this is we've got to look with fresh eyes sometimes at medieval sources, because there's a lot more technical expertise of whale behaviors that we can excavate from these texts. But also it reminds us of how many whales they encountered in antiquity. This is Olaus Magnus's map. This is me having augmented Olaus Magnus's map, because there were so many more whales of such greater size in the ancient world. A famous article by Joe Roman and Steve Palumbi estimated, using genetic bottlenecking, pre-industrial populations. And it's anywhere from 10 to 20 times the number of whales we see today. So maybe it's not that impressive that these medieval authors were documenting whales at sea, because there were so many of them they encountered. So where my project has added to this dialogue is by looking at some previously untranslated Icelandic sources. One of the richest is the Diplomatarium Zelandicum, and I'm nervous talking about this because I know Astrid's here, but we have a great colleague named Arnie Daniel Juliusson at the University of Iceland who's been translating this document for us for references to whale use. And what he's found across time, and I've just highlighted, this is a long passage, but he's been highlighting where the church, and this is a collection of church and monastic charters, where whale stranding beaches or whale landing beaches are recorded and how whales are divided when they are coming ashore. We're just now at the point of publication of this. We're writing this up. But what Arnie Daniels found is stranded whales are scrupulously divided. Rights to whales are jealously guarded, but at certain moments in time, there's sort of a free-for-all in terms of claiming quantities of meat and blubber and potentially bone. I've highlighted a few points here, stranded whales, and then it goes into a litany of divisions. When the verb transport is used, that often refers to a deliberate bringing of whales to shore. And you see immediately below that, it speaks about a shooter's share. So translation of the Diplomatarium has really made us rethink how the whale samples that we've been analyzing have come to shore. And that brings us to another document that we're also on the verge of publishing. And this is with another colleague at the Natural History Museum in Iceland, Vidar Hreinsson. And we're looking at Jon Lerði Guðmundsson's Natural History of Iceland, which has not yet been translated into English. You're looking at a selfie of Jon Lerði. He's got sort of a delightful little man bun, top knot at the top of his head. He is a precocious autodidact. He's an absolute savant when it comes to Iceland's nature. He has no time for frivolity in this document. He's not going to write about monstrous whales like Olaus did, but he does draw all the whales he talks about in two famous accounts, one maintained in Iceland and this chart of whales from Copenhagen, in which he draws all the species. And I'm going to come back to a couple of these in a moment, but quite notably, he's duplicating some species. So his account of the North Atlantic right whale is somewhat sobering. At 53 feet long, he says many of these whales have been taken by foreign whalers, so the species is being reduced. He also has an account of the gray whale, which disappears within a few decades of his authorship of this document. But the right whale, as many of you will know today, is in a steep decline. 340 animals left, according to the most current estimates, of which 72 are breeding females. One of the accomplishments of our study so far has been this article in Marine Mammal Science, which Martin and Ingrid both contributed to, and the Orkney materials helped with this snapshot. We've been quite interested in how our data and all archaeological data can speak to conservation biologists. So we were able to use archaeological data to chime in on an age-old question about how many populations of North Atlantic right whales there were. Is there a European population and an American population, or are they all one breeding population? And we found there's not much distinction. So hopefully this can be used by naturalists to try to figure out the future of the right whale. Now, the whale that has left us wholly flummoxed is the blue whale. And I see Astrid's commenting on the severe winter. I'm going to come back to a severe winter as well. The blue whale has caught us off guard in this project. It is the favorite whale of the Viking, the favorite whale of Norse settlers. It's a fast whale. It's rarely at the surface, so we don't know much about it today. And Jon Lerði says there are two species of blue whale. And we find this a little challenging. We don't know if we're looking at an actual blue whale and a bluefin hybrid, or what is going on in the North Atlantic. It's highly possible there are subspecies that we don't know about. It gets a little more complicated. Jan also says Icelanders are hunting the blue whale, which we are skeptical of, but that they're also hunting calves. So he's convinced that this is a whale that was accessible. The Kingsmere says everyone loves this whale. It's our favorite whale. It's good to eat, doesn't stink. The sagas tell us, the Icelandic sagas, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries are telling us this is a whale that comes ashore frequently. And it is also a deeply challenging whale for us because we have so many of them on the Icelandic sites. And when we looked at the individual genetic data for these, we have probably 3 dozen individual whales, blue whales over time. So it's not one animal being used and reused. This is not what we anticipated. The next largest number we have in Iceland is humpbacks. So this brings us to the question of how are they getting all these blue whales, which they claim is the most desirable, but is also really fast and challenging to get at. So that's the lingering question we have right now. A quick word on our Icelandic archaeological sites. We have a crew of great archaeologists from NABO we work with. These are just a few of the sites we look at: high status, farm sites, coastal sites. Most of the sites we've been looking at, probably about 80% of our whale bones have come from northern Iceland. And we're lucky to have tetrachronological dating, which for the purposes of our project, we've divided up into climatic eras writ large, sort of warmer phases and Little Ice Age colder phases with this interim phase. And this is still a system that's up for debate, but it's been heuristically helpful as we're trying to crunch these data and tell a story about whales. So what the data tells us when divided up into these 2 early and later phases, lots of biodiversity of cetaceans in the early phase when things are theoretically a little warmer. And by the time things are getting dramatically colder, smaller species, toothed species drop out of the picture. So what you're looking at on the left is a wider biodiversity of cetaceans, and over on the right of the screen is what happens when cold sets in. And curiously, blue whales completely dominate both phases still. So the blue whales become a constant. Now, this led us to an experimental concept of, how many whales are actually stranding. So we went back to Michael Moore, who's an expert at whale strandings, in an article called Beach Bloat, Float, and Sink. So right whales famously float. They're the right whale to hunt because you can easily drag them to shore. Blue whales are stinkers and sinkers. They're not going to float to shore readily. What this article tells us is most whales that die at sea are sinking, drifting, or going somewhere else. They're not stranding. A very small percentage of whales strand. So this also leaves us questioning our blue whale data. How are we getting so many blue whales? So a month ago, this is where my talk would have ended, and I'm excited to hear what Jen has to say, and I'm going to get to that. But something else has come up in the interim. So our conclusions that we're pretty chuffed about, we've got a really good contribution for right whale population dynamics. We've added to discussions about medieval knowledge of species and behaviors and depletion and division. Archaeological assemblages are showing us climatic patterns that we could have anticipated, so that's nice verification of whale use. But the blue whales are vexing. And this is where everything changed last month. And I'm just going to talk about this very briefly because I know I took a little time in the glitch. Last month, we met a really dynamic lead archaeologist from Iceland named Lísabet Guðmundsdóttir, who's been all over the news in Iceland. And I think this is going to be near and dear to this audience's heart. If we don't investigate this now, it'll be too late. She's excavating some sites in the north of Iceland, a site called Hafnir and a site called Strandir. And these sites are being lost to the sea. And I know folks in Orkney can identify with this tragically all too well. So what's cool about these sites and what has gotten us scrambling is there's tons and tons of whale bone And they're also Viking Age sites. So we have massive whalebone artifacts coming out in the dozens, eroding into the sea, and a Viking Age bone workshop of some kind that seems to be focusing on whalebone. So we've got an emergency grant, and we're going to C14 and ADNA and Zoom all we can very quickly to try to help Lisa Bet get some grant money behind her project so she can go dig these before they disappear. Her sites also have whale pits. And when she dug these, now the large ones you see are from Ivar Peterson. This is from a unique event that I'm going to ask Astrid about when we're done. In 1882, there was a massive whale stranding in Iceland. But the smaller image below, it's not of the pits in Strondir, but in the excavations, the pits were gummy, they were greasy, so they're definitely whale processing pits. So we're going to do environmental DNA analysis of these. These two sites, Hopnir and Strondir, are also adjacent to another famous site in northern Iceland. So this is where our diplomatarium evidence is coming from. All those charters with all those whale divisions. Same location as these two new sites. So these are the archaeological sites, and this is Ánestaðir. And at this location, somehow after 8 years of working, we've narrowed into this one location. In 1882, there was a summer of whales. One event in May saw blue whales icebound at Ánestaðir, 32 live blue whales icebound that were dispatched at great difficulty by local farmers. Ivar Peterson has just published this in an Icelandic natural history journal. 460 large whales stranded over about a 3-month period, many of them icebound, and they were shared across northern and western Iceland during a period of horrible famine. So now, as we're looking at all of our blue whale data, we're thinking, oh my goodness, is there a different story that we need to be telling? So we've got 2 new archaeological sites, a Viking Age whalebone workshop of some sort, and this tragic story of the 19th century. So as our project is winding to an end, we've got another year's worth of work ahead of us that we're really excited about. And that's what I have for you today. So I'm happy to answer questions later, but I'm even happier to pass this over to Jen.
Oh, thanks, Vicki. That was absolutely amazing. I think there's some really interesting questions there about reactions to weather and changing weather and how that affects populations. Does anyone have a quick question directly now for Vicki, or do we want to go into looking in detail at one site? Yeah, I think I'll start mine now then, and we can look at it holistically at the end. Okay. Right. Are you guys seeing the full screen or presenter view? I can never tell which way around it's going to be.
Seeing full screen.
Thank you. Lovely. Okay, so I'm going to talk in detail about one particular site from Orkney, which you might have seen in the media. It's a site called Cata Sand, and it has 2 strange whaling pits full of headless whales. So this is the site, and the story starts in the Neolithic, but very quickly we get into the post-medieval era. These are some pictures of the site under excavation. It's on the island of Sanday, which is a very sandy island. The clue is in the name. And this dig is on a quite amazing area that is just on the edge of the intertidal zone, and it's a very large kind of shallow bay where the water comes in and comes right up to the site. So one has to be very aware of the tides, and it's challenging to dig. People have to wear goggles, and it's a Neolithic settlement, and that's great. And then what we have dug in there are these 2 long pits. You can see one of them in the picture there. They dug into the archaeology, and this is what we're interested in. So here's a close-up of one of the pits, and when this was being excavated, for the second time in my life, I've had a phone call going, we need a zoo archaeologist on site right now. And so Ingrid and I were able to go, and we went up to Sanday and had a look at these amazing whales. So as you can see, there's strips of vertebrae. They're all in the correct anatomical position. There's also a number of flippers. So you can see the sort of shoulder and then the long, the fingers, if you like, within the flippers. And the map there shows the exact location of this. So what we were interested in was what was happening here. What on earth is going on with this story? So there's two pits. One of them has been left in situ, and the other one was excavated. I mean, it's right in the middle of the Neolithic archaeology, so they've excavated it. The bones were sticking out. They are in quite poor preservation, which is unfortunate. They'd been washed by extreme high tides, so they'd been bleached by the sun as well. Bits were sticking out, and they're very crumbly, but we've done our best. So one pit was fully excavated. It had 7 bodies in it. And we've got bits of fins and shoulders, but they're not always in the right place where you'd expect them. And there are no heads. So there's a picture here, and this is the species that they are. They're long-finned pilot whales, and this is what they look like with their heads on. So this is the spy hopping position that we've just seen from Vicki's presentation, so that head's sticking out. What we had is a mix of age and sizes, and these, we knew that before we had Vicki involved with it, we knew that they were mid-sized cetaceans. So they weren't huge, nothing like blue whale or anything like that, or fin whale, but they're also bigger than the little ones, so not harbor porpoises or common dolphins either. But it's really hard to identify them without heads. So there are places that have good whale reference collections, but it's a challenge. And we don't really have that many whales in our reference collections here. So it's a real challenge, but this is where biomolecular methods came in. And Vicki and Brenna were able to tell us quite quickly that these were long-finned pilot whales. Now, this is no surprise. They are species that are well known in this area of the North Atlantic. And this is a picture of the species here. When I started to research them a bit more, I found the Latin name, Globicephala melas. And then in the brackets there, it has the attribution for the person who first named the species, Trail, 1809. Now, Trail is a very Orkney surname. And in the picture here, this was from the original publication identifying the species. Thomas Stewart Trail says, a nondescript species of the order Cetes, 92 of which were driven ashore in Scapa Bay, which is Scapa, a few days before the Great Storm in December of 1807. And the picture I particularly like because it has a kind of evil look to it. And this is very much in keeping with ideas of the monsters of the deep and these animals that were seen as other. They weren't seen, people didn't really know they were mammals, let alone recognize their intelligence at the time. So this is really telling. We've got a large shoal of these animals that were driven ashore, either naturally stranding or were driven deliberately. And we'll come on to that. But these animals are still driven ashore today. These are the animals that feature in the Faroese Grind, the Faroese whale hunting that still goes on today. Now, it's a good reminder. I'm using the term whale. These are actually dolphins. We say whaling. What we actually mean is kind of whale and dolphin hunting. But they're very closely related to the orcas, the killer whales. They're just a slightly smaller relative. They're pretty big, though. Males up to 6.5 meters or so. Females just over 5, almost 6. So they're big, but not too big. In terms of their modern conservation status, it's a good story. There isn't that much known about population numbers, but they're not in any particular concern. However, you know, there's questions we could ask about how big populations were even just a few hundred years ago. They're really sociable. They live in big groups. And they come together sometimes into these massive pods. Well, so they live in small pods and then they come together in groups of over 1,000 animals. And they will, if one gets into difficulty, maybe a female's having trouble calving, or there's an old one who's having trouble, one strands and the rest follow. So you end up with natural strandings of hundreds of these animals, but they're also very quick to be driven ashore. So they're very easy to scare. And the Faroese do this today, probably in the same way that people have been doing for hundreds, if not over 1,000 years in the North Atlantic. You get in behind a shoal and you can drive them to shore by throwing stones into the water, by making a lot of noise, by banging, and they can be kind of driven to the shore. So they're still hunted today in the Faroes. I didn't want to put up any pictures of those hunts, but there are loads online. It is shocking. There's a lot of ethical considerations there, of course. So last year, the Faroese killed 667 of them. They also killed 1,500 white-sided dolphins, and those are an endangered species, and they've now reflected on that, and they've set up a quota system. There's still some ethical concerns there, but the picture shows that in the Faroes, they still eat this. The middle bit is blubber, or spit, as they call it, and there's some dried whale meat at the bottom with potatoes and some dried fish. So what we're dealing with our pit of whales is a very unusual sight, and normally in archaeological terms, whales are often termed invisible because we just don't tend to find them. People don't bring whole whales to settlement sites. And what we have here is a very non-typical, very unusual site. And in zooarchaeological terms, there's a number of ways that people have determined over the years to work out how an animal is being used. There's various indices. And if we were to apply those to what we have here, we can rule out the indices that are all about meat or using the bone for artifacts. And what we're left with is the indices that indicate oil and fat is of significance. And the missing bits we have are the oily bits. So we're missing the cranium and the mandible and maxilla, and those are all the most oily bits. So what zooarchaeologically we'd be able to say is that probably we have the discards from an industry that is using oil and blubber as well, of course, so that's kind of invisible. Next big question is, what on earth is the date of this? It's not Neolithic. There's still grease on the bones, so that indicates it's not too old. Cetacean bones will continue to be greasy for quite some time, and some in reference collections can be completely disgusting. But yeah, so still greasy. So that says it's probably only a few hundred years old, you know. And there's also modern style glass and metal fragments found, so not Neolithic because there's metal. And this is where we get into the history. I am no historian whatsoever, but we have this really interesting account of a guy who's called John Sinclair. He's a young lad. He's 22 years old, and in 1819, he visits Sanday, and he writes about it. So a little bit of the background for John Sinclair. Young John is one of the younger sons of Sir John Sinclair. He's in the picture, and you might recognize him because he started the old statistical account, which led to the new statistical account. He introduced the word statistical to the English language. So this young son, young John, he's at a loose end. He's finished studying divinity at Oxford, and he's at home in Thurso Castle at a bit of a loose end, so decides to take a ride up to Sanday with the Caithness Sheriff Depute, James Trail, and much later on he publishes his diary. So what we know, young John arrives on Sanday, 8th of August, 1819, and he details his day, and I've been able to reconstruct it. So the star shows where the bones were found, where Cata Sand is. So we know that young John lands here, they anchor off here, they go visit the local vicar, Reverend Grant. He will feature in the story in a minute. He goes and visits some caves, and then young John is left to his own devices to go and visit his friend in Tresness. And he's given a horse and said, off you go. You can see where you go, and the land is really flat. Off you go. So he gets almost all the way there and then goes, oh, for goodness sake, there's this big body of water in the way. It's late afternoon. The tide is in. I figured that out from looking at almanacs. And he has to go all the way around Cata Sand. And in so doing, he comes across something disgusting, and he writes about it. Big quote here, but this is very important for our story. As I was pursuing my solitary way, I discovered upon the beach a number of whales, what we now know as longfin pilot whales, as they're called locally, the bottlenoses. And the blubber had been cut off, and they were in a horrid state of decomposition and tainting the air for miles. On inquiry, I was informed that 2 Sundays before, so 25th of July, 1819, when Mr. Grant was delivering one of his best discourses, a report was whispered among the congregation that a great shoal of bottlenoses was seen in the adjoining bay, and all the men rush off to deal with the whales. With the help of my colleague Sarah Jane Gibbon, who's a historian, we worked out which church was in use that Sunday, because they alternated. It's this church. The whales were seen off of this bit down here, and here's a ruin of the church as we went to see it this summer, and the whales would have been spotted out there. I wonder if someone was perhaps staring out the window going, oh my goodness, Reverend Grant, you're going on and on. So what else can we find out about this? Well, Reverend Grant was really not very happy about this, and he starts legal action because the men who rushed off, the captors of these whales, they committed a gross violation of the Sabbath, and there are 14 court records all about this. The men are named and shamed. We have their names. We know where they lived. And that's shown on the map. And there's good descriptions in the court cases about what the men did. They basically rushed out of church ran around really quickly trying to get whatever weaponry they could find, old swords and firearms, and they got in the boats and chased the whales. Now, eventually, it takes 3 years, but the captors admit, yes, okay, they went whaling on a Sunday, but, Your Honor, there's a reason. The scarcity and high price of oil in these islands. So there's very little that they have for light. They say there's no other light than what is afforded from the dim glimpse of a sod, because Sanday has no peat. They need light. And the captors remind the court that Greenland whaling is allowed on Sunday and that local kelp burning is allowed by the landlords on a Sunday. So why on earth can't they go and kill the whales? And eventually the sheriff agrees, and he says, okay, right, the captors have admitted they've breached the Sabbath, but they have apologized, and so no expenses are due, and that's the end of it. Goes on and on for a while, and I bet the men were a bit worried. There might have been fines, but so what we know from this is that this is all about the oil. So we know that from other historical sources as well, and from these court cases, we know that blubber is stripped from the carcasses and melted into oil, and then we've got the heads being boiled directly. Now, whale oil is used for lighting, and it is a wonderful fuel for lighting. But what the people normally had was fish oil. So it's cod liver oil, it's safe liver oil, which is available, but it smells and it smokes and it's not very nice. Whale oil can be disgusting while you're making it, but when you're burning it, it burns really brightly with no smell. And they're burning them in these little cruisy lights. This is one at one of the farm museums today. And if you're wondering what they burn now, this is what they burn now, crisp and dry. Now, I was interested in consumption of the whale meat. And what we find historically is it was probably last eaten in Shetland in the 1690s during the famine years. And then there's the odd record of North Ronaldsay still eating seal up until the late 18th century. But in every case when that's mentioned, it's always, and they're doing something a bit different in North Ronaldsay, but we don't do that in the rest of Orkney. So I got really excited at this point. This has been like a gateway into a whole new kind of line of inquiry for me. Normally I'm looking at bones. Here I'm in archives, I'm looking at records, I'm going through court records, old newspapers, and looking at old photos too, because of course we are within the era of early photography. This picture here shows a whale hunt in Shetland in 1899, and if we zoom in on it, now the sea would have been red and all of this. These are all pilot whales, and you can see there's one there that's had its head cut off. And you can see in the foreground, what looks like a large bag or something is actually 2 pilot whale heads. And then you can see the piles of blubber in the background. So I have been poring over old records, trying to get a hold of people who can help me read old handwriting. And there's a fantastic group of volunteers working in the archives who have helped me translate, not translate, that's the wrong word, just help me read some old documents. I can handle the ones back to like late 1700s, and then I really struggle. Old newspapers are fantastic too to catch the 19th century. And what I found are hundreds and hundreds of cases where people fight over whales, so they write about it and they quantify the whales and they say where they were found. So this goes back as far as the Stuart Earls, who had Orkney and Shetland as their little kind of feudal estates. They are claiming and taking whales. Then we've got the Crown weighing in whenever anything is really big. So the big ones, the fin whales, sperm whales, stuff like that. They're all declared as royal fish, and they take them. And then we've got landlords insisting on taking a 1/3 share of whale hunts in Shetland, and tenants fight back. And again, we've got this in the records, they're fighting back. There's a really big case in the 1880s, which finally goes to the Court of Session in Edinburgh, and the landlords are told, you got to stop claiming 1/3 share here. But that's actually, it ends up being the last big hunt anyway. And we've got people stealing whales. We've got people sneaking in at night, like floating off dead whales. But they're kind of hard to hide. So people find them in the morning and then go, that was my whale. And then, no, it wasn't. Yes, it was. Goes to the sheriff court. It all gets written down. We've got actual physical fighting. We've got fighting over women's rights to shares as well. So that normally this is a very male world, and when you get a group of people, it's often quite like small communities that come together, but it can be dozens or even like up to 100 or so men who work together, men and boys, and then they divide all the profits equally, which is really nice. The boys normally get a half share. But if any women are involved, they don't get any shares, until Barbara Sutherland said, this is just not fair. And she actually leads a whale hunt in the 1830s. And she's called the Flotta Amazon after that because she gets her share. So that also goes through the courts. We have a lot of reports about people being disgusted by blubber. As we approach 1900 as well, people are saying this is not very hygienic, this is disgusting. We've got worries about cholera as well from about the 1830s, and people say that the blubber causes cholera. And we've got some local doctors weighing in and saying, well, it might be disgusting, but it's certainly not causing cholera. And we've got people trying to make a bit of profit on the side by boiling blubber in their back garden in Kirkwall, and other people going, good grief, what are you doing? That smells disgusting. And it's all written down, and it's fantastic. And what I've been able to do is quantify all of this stuff. So we've got, in Orkney, we've got about 9,000 animals killed with 189 different events. In Shetland, it's over 20,000 animals killed over almost 200 events. When I say event, mostly these are deliberate hunts. Sometimes there are strandings, and very occasionally these are bigger cetaceans as well, and those tend to be natural strandings. Every couple of years, Orkney gets a fin whale that seems to wash up, or it washes up alive and then dies. And this has been going on for some time, and we, down in South Ronald, say we've got Martin's site at the Cairns, where they have fin whales. I'm going to guess they're not actively hunting those. Those are making good use of strandings. So I've been able to quantify this. I haven't finished my archival work, but what I've quantified here shows three things. We've got Orkney in blue and Shetland in orange, and that's on the left vertical axis. I've also put the Faroese data in here just for pilot whales, and the Faroese have been recording very precisely what they have been hunting. So that's on the right-hand axis. So there's a lot more whales killed in the Faroes. They're a species that likes slightly more northern waters, but they will certainly come down as far as Scotland. And now the pattern matches for both of these. We see this real peak in the 1850s. What we also see is this slightly strange period here. It's the 1760s, 70s, 80s. There's a real time when there are almost no pilot whales being hunted here or in the Faroes. This is a time when George Lowe, who's the local Orkney naturalist who writes Fauna Orchidensis, he's living here then. And he writes about this and complains that he's lived here 20 odd years and never seen a pilot whale. I sympathize. I have also never seen them. But so we have this time when they're just not here. Now, where are they? Is this a weather event? I don't think this would be related to overexploitation. However, this peak here, this 1850s peak, I think, and its subsequent fall, I think that's a real peak in the numbers that were killed. And I think probably what we're seeing after that is a response to that. The numbers really do decline because of overexploitation. It's my hypothesis, and I'd like to work on this more. So what we've got, to summarize it all, we have an organized system. It's in place from the 18th century. This is very much, local shore-based, domestic scale whaling, but in the context of the Greenland fleet coming through. They're going up to Greenland, to Jan Mayen, and they're going up to hunt large whales. They are picking up workers as well for those fleets in Orkney and Shetland. So people are aware of whales. We've got whale oil literally oiling the Industrial Revolution. So what we've got is these organized whale drives. We've got blubber being stripped, heads removed. Often there's an auction held immediately in most areas. The more remote areas, they're not holding an auction. They're probably not exchanging the blubber for cash as much. So it's probably what we're seeing at Cata Sand. We're seeing that whale product being used very locally. So they're boiling it up in their back gardens at home on Sanday. Whereas on mainland, on the bigger islands, we get this whale blubber entering the commercial world immediately. We get cash being exchanged for it. We get the bigger shop owners buying it up and rendering it down. And we actually have a boiling house. It's called the Oily House in Kirkwall. Is in the picture here, where there was a sort of small industry, if you like, of boiling up the oil. Is where just along the shoreline, where kind of at the very sort of eastern end of Kirkwall, where there used to be the kind of ambulance station, which I don't think is there anymore. But what we also know is that there are larger natural strandings happening at the time, and there's a fin or blue whale that washes up on Owskerry in 1777, and the whole industry immediately kind of erupts around it as they build these big pits for rendering down the oil, and they get coopers in to make the barrels, and then that oil is eventually sold to Newcastle. So that was all documented, and that's quite an interesting story. And then we have the ad. So the ad at the top there is 1838, and it's an ad for whale oil being sold by a Mr. Cursitor merchants in Kirkwall. So what's different about Cata Sand? I mean, why do we have this little window into this now really forgotten industry? Well, we know that the bodies are normally left for the sea, and we see recorded cases where bodies wash up again and people get cross and they refloat them, off they go. Now at Cata Sand, that area, that intertidal area, the sea is just not very powerful there. It couldn't take the bodies away. And I think what happened is locals probably got really cross at the smell and someone had to go and bury them. We know from the mid-19th century, bodies are sold, often for very little money, but they are sold and they're used as fertilizer. They're put on the land. They're often taken a long way and kind of ground up by industrial sort of factories. So what we had is Cata Sand gives us this unique window into this whole industry. We don't know for certain that the story involving Reverend Grant and young John, we don't know for certain whether that story is definitely matched with Cata Sand, but in some ways it doesn't matter because it was my gateway into this whole big history. There's so many wonderful stories that I wish I had more time to tell about the fighting over whales. Now, where have the heads ended up? Well, they might be being boiled and burnt, so it's possible there ends up being a lot of oil still in the bones, so maybe they're used for fuel almost. But we do know there's a couple of places where these skulls are used for walls, at Quantrenness and mainland, and then also in Shetland. This picture here from the 30s shows a wall being made out of pilot whale heads. So what's next? Well, I think there's a lot of work I still need to do to understand sort of the environmental history of what's happening with pilot whales. Why do we get that big trough? Why do we get the peak? Why are there no big shoals of 1,000+ animals today? What's changed with their ecology? What's changed with the waters that they might like to be in? I think there's a lot of questions we can ask. I think one of the other things I found is that there's really interesting perceptions about how people view these animals. So locals are often saying these monsters of the deep, these awful things. They have no empathy for them, and yet we've got tourists starting to show an interest in the live animals as early as 1849 at John O'Groats. People suddenly realizing, oh, maybe if we don't kill them, maybe there's actually some value we can get in showing these to tourists. So that's really interesting, that the changing attitudes. There's a lot more I'd like to do in the archives when I have time. And one of the sub-stories that has emerged from this is the bigger whales that are washing up here, and then they end up in Natural History Museum collections, and they form the basis for the reference collections that are in some big museums. So this particular animal here, this is a sperm whale washed up in Thurso in August of 1863. It produced copious quantities of oil that was sold commercially, claimed by the Crown because it's a royal fish, it's really big. But a local landlord bought the remains and skeletonized it, and then gave it to the British Museum, and it was in the main hall at the entrance until 1901. I think the Diplodocus kicked it out. But so you have these amazing stories, and I think the part of this is reading these stories and being in the archives, being able to read this stuff has just been an absolute joy, and I look forward to reading more about this, to spending more time in the archives. So I must mention on the slide here that the many people who have helped with this process, and I must mention Lucy Morris particularly, who did her master's last year. During that process, she catalogued all of the bones, which was fantastic. And then numerous people have helped me with the historical stuff because I am no historian. Carolyn Dixon definitely gets a call out there. She's a volunteer from Sanday, and she transcribed a 5-meter long scroll about 66 whales found on Sanday in 1715. I could barely work out which way up to hold the document, and she transcribed it. It's 10,000 words long, and it talks in a very repetitive way, I'd have to say, but it talks about this is fighting over whales, basically, and it's one of the many stories. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Jen, and thank you, Vicki. I'm just enthralled here. That was so fascinating. Wow, so many stories to tell about whales. I think I saw that whale skeleton in the Natural History Museum in London last month, because Dippy has been moved to another room, or Dippy's on tour, and there's a whale skeleton that's hanging up in the main hall.
That's another one. That one's called Hope, and it's a blue whale.
I see.
The sperm whales are, they're big, but they're not that big. Yeah.
Lots of folk are saying this is brilliant here. Dave Brink is asking what became of the British Museum whale skeleton then.
I think it's still there. I don't know. I'd like to go and look. They've certainly got a few others, and Aberdeen certainly has some interesting ones that have come from up here. Zoe mentions a whale head on Sanday. I would love to know more about that.
Is this a place name? Yes, says Zoe. Where in Sanday is this, Zoe? On the east side, possibly.
I've found lots of records of whales coming ashore on Sanday. The Newark beach and up in the northwest, and lots of different places. Baccascale Bay features a lot.
Nearer to the lighthouse. You think of Start Point? Before Start Point, okay.
Around Newark, yeah. I think place name evidence is definitely something that I need to explore, and we do have. Well, I mean, Vicky would know this more than I would. There are lots of places that have whale type names. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? I'm looking higher up. Oh yeah, we could go back to Astrid's comment on the severe winter of 1602. Seems like it did for the whales, according to Jon Lærdi. Certainly a devastating time for humans and livestock. Did you want to come back to that, Vicky?
Oh, Astrid would know these seasonal issues better than me by far. But in 1602, he says there's a terrible winter and all the monsters disappear. And 1882 was a horrific season, and again, Astrid will know this better than I do, in which the whales saved the population without question. So I think Jan is right. I think he also doesn't really want to sort of engage with that monstrous mythology. He's a very pragmatic sort when he's talking about his whales. I do have a quick comment for Jen, and I think I've mentioned this. We had a North Carolina whaling industry that was only for head oil, and they would, as awful as this sounds, they would beach the dolphins in this case and keep them alive for as long as possible in order to keep the oil at its fresh maximum before they would extract it. So it's quite the removal of the heads is it's a strategic sort of act in some ways to keep that oil at its peak utility, which sounds awful and soulless, but that's how it was.
Would they separate out the head oil from rendering down the blubber? Yeah, so different degrees. I think up here they probably didn't quite have the quality sort of differentiation. We all go in together, I suspect. But there certainly are, when they find sperm whales, I think there's an appreciation that spermaceti oil might be a bit different, but I don't know that they quite know what to do with it yet. Did I see that? Could I just ask about the thing about the climate? I'm wondering whether, so you had your 1602 was a bad time. The 1760s, 1770s, 1780s, when we have that real decline in the Faroes and less so up here. But is that related to climate? Does anyone know what's going on? What would happen with whale populations in that time? It's a bit late for the medievalists and a bit too old for the people who just look at very modern day stuff and kind of in between.
While people type on that, there's a quick question from Zoe here. Have the Cata Sand bones been dated? Could they be dated? Or did you mean to imply they were from that Sunday hunt?
Well, I think they are. The trouble is, if you use radiocarbon dating, if any of that carbon is from the sea, it lingers in the sea for quite a long time and makes whatever you're dating look very old. And that's why we always try to date terrestrial mammals. So we go for cattle. I mean, even sheep, you wanted to make sure they're not eating too much seaweed, because if you date anything that has marine protein in it, the answer is a bit nonsensical. You can have this is called a marine offset, but it's very difficult to know what that offset value is, which is why we wouldn't date marine bones directly. I don't know, Vicki, if you've been having to deal with that conundrum of how to radiocarbon date a bit of, no, you don't do it.
Nope.
No.
Nope. And we're working out the C14s for these new sites, but I mean, we haven't had any luck with the bones, with the whale bones.
Yeah, I mean, normally if we're finding whale bones in conjunction with normal stuff, we go for a nice bit of cow. Okay, Martin has a question here.
The idea of fear of whales, less so, I think, in the North Atlantic, but definitely in England. Sort of early medieval English accounts of whales are far more skeptical of their utility. And they really do embody much more the monstrous qualities. But I think the Icelandic and the Norwegian sources are pretty straightforward. They'll repeat some of the monstrous stories, but they're too into using whales. I think they wouldn't turn a whale down.
Nick comments here that he found some large whale vertebrae on the north side of South Walls on Hoy, which locals said came ashore in the 1920s and was butchered for local consumption.
I'm just looking at my database of all the strandings I have. I just want to see if I have that one in.
And then Nick is also saying, would anyone like to study some early Neolithic whalebone, including a vertebrate that came up at the nest this year? So if you're interested for a master's project or something, contact Nick.
I will say we've actually just been re-upped by the National Science Foundation. So if there's any way of processing some of the bone, and I know that there are some people who could probably do that, we might have the means to do DNA. So we'd be interested in doing that.
Annabelle says the Cairns whale had one fin whale found throughout the site, but has any analysis been done on Neolithic whalebone finds?
We haven't. I don't know, Jen, would you know if anyone else has?
Just wondering. Let me see. Well, off the top of my head, no. There is the whalebone figure in Stromness Museum from Skara Brae, and it's quite a substantial figure, probably from one of the bigger whales. And I think Mike Buckley was going to do zooms on it, or someone said someone had asked him, and he was going to sneak it into a project. I don't know. I haven't heard anything about that. But that's going to be a really big whale that will have naturally stranded. It's a really good question, because in the Neolithic, we're thinking the seas are pretty pristine and people are not fishing that much. There would have been whales seen regularly. People would have seen them, heard them, smelled them, even, dare I say, and certainly the ones that wash up make their presence known when they're decaying. You smell them for miles. And people would have had access to the bone. I think there'd certainly be potential for adding that to the list of potential student topics for masters or even undergrad, to look at these bits. And often, what we have sometimes, yes, there are beautiful big vertebrae, and Martin's had amazing stuff, but also what most of the actual fragments are small fragments that you can say is cetacean, but you need Vicki's help here and to do something about finding a species ID. Because it is very challenging to work out what they are when they've been whacked about a bit.
Back in the 90s, when I was doing my PhD research, I was terrified of the Neolithic assemblages because so many were Skara Brae, and I didn't want to touch anything. It was too frightening. But as far as I know, there's not been an analysis of Neolithic, and there's a lot. There's a lot. That'd be a great thesis.
Nick mentions the mace head from the nets as well, a whalebone mace head. That would be interesting to find out more about. Astrid came back with some more info here about whale migrations and ocean temperature. She says, My colleague Marianne Rasmussen, who's investigating blue whales off Northern Iceland, it seems they may be moving northwards, for example, to Svalbard.
There are very few people who study blue whales, and it's a very small group. So we're contacting folks to help us figure out the genetic story there. A blue whale stranded in Nova Scotia last year. And Brenna Fraser, who's done all of our DNA work, helped necropsy it, which was, as you can imagine, fairly insane. And they've been doing genetic work on those samples. I've necropsied a pilot whale last year, and I know Jen has necropsied a fin whale. So we're all learning about these animals from the inside out, and it's as disturbing as it is, it's really helpful when you're studying whales to have that opportunity.
Just feeling the oil that gets on your gloves.
Yeah.
I've also cut up quite a few seals and harbor porpoises too, as part of the marine mammal stranding scheme. I hasten to add,
Yes.
just to take samples for this government scheme to work out the health of marine mammal populations. But what an experience it is to cut them up, to actually work out just the sheer volume of animal that you're dealing with, and the depth of the fat. It's a very physical experience that it takes over your senses. You taste it for days afterwards. It's incredible.
It also, after we had necropsied a pilot whale that had been in the Outer Banks of North Carolina for 2 months, and it hadn't it hadn't moved. So once they plant, they stay. But thinking back to pre-modern folks, no matter the state the whale was in, it's resources you would take and use. So it's an interesting process to go through.
I'm enjoying this so much. I don't want to stop, but I suppose we'd better stop. Are there any last comments or questions?
I just had a comment privately from someone intrigued about the meat that was left behind. And I think so many of these pilot whales would have represented an absolutely massive amount of meat, but there is cultural attitudes that had shifted that say we don't eat that. And so they didn't. And it's a shame, really. But at the same time, there's they are still eaten in the Faroes, but now that's a real shame as well. There's a lot of ethical considerations there. I know it's continuity of these traditions that we're talking about, but not all traditions need to continue.
Last note from Astrid here. The Icelandic expression for a windfall corresponds to a stranded whale. Yes. Valreki. Wow. So this new stranded whale tax. Yes. Everyone says it was an excellent presentation and big thank yous all around. Really interesting evening, and speak soon. I'll stop the recording there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. That was amazing.